So that's a little bit about how we're going to run today. Essentially, we're just hoping that you'll all be able to learn a little bit more about the UK's response to the GBF. As I said, a few presentations to begin with and lots of time for Q&A afterwards. Before we start all of that, I wanted to just give you a couple of slides just to outline what the CBD is, just so we're all on the same level there. Now, as I say this, I realised that I didn't click through a couple of the slides I was supposed to, I think, but I think we can go through them. I've covered the housekeeping. That's absolutely fine. And I think we can see that we've set the agenda out there. So what is the CBD, or the Convention on Biological Diversity? It is a legally binding multilateral environmental agreement, or in perhaps more common parlance, it's a treaty between nations. It's a treaty between countries which sets out how governments around the world, how society around the world is going to come together to conserve biological diversity. It's what's known as a framework convention. And what that means is the text of the convention itself provides a framework for the governments, for the countries of the world to have this conversation. So the text itself doesn't specify all the activities that are going to be done. It provides that framework for governments to then further elaborate on what activities will be taken. So, as I've said there, it establishes the guidelines and the principles to provide an organisational framework to adopt more specific obligations. CBD itself as a treaty has 3 objectives. They are the conservation of biological diversity, which is probably not a huge surprise given the title of the treaty, the sustainable use of components of biological diversity. So this is just saying when humanity uses biodiversity, it does so in a way that future generations will be able to benefit from that same resource. And finally, the fair and equitable sharing of the benefits arising from the use of genetic resources. And that's a sort of more complicated area I won't go into there, but you can always ask some questions later if you want to know a bit more about that. So what is the Global Biodiversity Framework, or the GBF? To give it its full name, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Well, it is one of those more specific set of obligations to save nature. So if it's a framework, as we said, it's a framework convention, which provides that process to elaborate on further obligations, activities. This is one of those obligations and activities, called the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework because it was jointly agreed between Kunming and Montreal. And it is what's known in common parlance as soft law. So the framework itself is not legally binding. What is legally binding is the resolution which adopted the framework, which parties are legally bound to implement, but the decision itself urges parties and other governments as appropriate to implement the framework. So it's a kind of nuanced space where the treaty itself doesn't say we have to deliver on it, but as the parties to the convention, and the UK of course is a party to that convention, we are bound by that decision that urges us to implement the framework, which also invites parties to cooperate at the transboundary regional and international levels. So it's saying we need to cooperate around implementing it, both within a country and between countries as well. I'm trying to wait for the slide to move forward. There we go. So to give a bit more detail on what the GBF is, it has a purpose laid out to catalyse urgent and transformative action to halt and reverse biodiversity loss. Which I think is quite black and white, really. It is designed to stimulate transformative and urgent action, which will lead to the restoration of nature and in turn the conservation of biological diversity. Aligned with that purpose is a vision, which is that by 2050, biodiversity is valued, conserved, restored, and wisely used, maintaining ecosystem services, sustaining a healthy planet, and delivering benefits essential for all people. So it's that longer term vision there that we're living sustainably with biodiversity. And there is a mission, which is to 2030 to take urgent action to halt and reverse biodiversity loss, to put nature on a path to the recovery for the benefit of people and planet by conserving and sustainably using biodiversity and ensuring the fair and equitable sharing of benefits from the use of genetic resources while providing the necessary means of implementation. Now, those of you more familiar with international negotiations will note that that is very standard UN text. I realise that for us mere mortals, that sort of text is quite blunt, not blunt, it's quite dense, sorry, and can be a little bit hard to interpret. But essentially what it is saying is that by 2030, the parties will take that urgent action to start reversing the decline in nature, restoring nature and conserving biological diversity for the benefit of all and future generations. To achieve the GBF, there are 23 targets which are spread across 4 goals. And these 23 targets are designed to be activities which governments can take in order to achieve the mission and the vision and the purpose. So we often get very focused on the targets, and this talk today is going to focus a lot on the targets, but it's important not to forget the bigger picture of what we're aiming for here. It's not just those individual targets. Those targets for a very complicated and lengthy negotiation of 196 countries. You know, that's quite a hard thing to get agreement from 196 countries. Just think yourselves, when you've ever tried to go to dinner and arrange a restaurant between your friends, how difficult that is. Now try save the world with 196 voices. It's quite hard. So this process that's been negotiated so wonderfully through the 196 countries is pushing us forward. These targets are the way in which we'll hold each other to account and a way to spur action. But they are not the sum total of the action as well, because we should all be driving towards the mission, the vision and the purpose. But the targets are what inevitably we focus on, because that provides the more discrete, the more detail as where we're moving forward. And essentially what we're going to be presenting today is how the 4 governments of the UK collectively will, as the UK, respond to the Global Biodiversity Framework. And we will look at that particularly in the context of these targets. So I've not put these targets on here. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. So hopefully, from my little words here, everyone is now familiar with the CBD, understands what it is, a treaty to save nature, understands what a GBF is, a plan to do that over the coming years. And I'm now going to hand you over to my colleague Claire Whitfield, who is going to discuss how the UK is responding to that and where the responsibilities lie within that. Claire, I have forgotten what I have to press to transfer the screen to you. What do I have to do?
Don't transfer, just move on the slide, I think.
Move on the slide. There we go.
Okay, so thank you, Danny. So yes, I'm Claire Whitfield. I'm team leader for JNCC's Nature Conservation Policy and Advice team. So moving from Danny's introduction of the Global Biodiversity Framework and the Convention more widely, I'm going to move from that global perspective to think about implementation in the UK. And Danny, you can move the slide on 1, please. So whilst the UK government is the signatory to the Convention on Biological Diversity, environment policy is a devolved responsibility in the UK, and so implementation is the responsibility of the UK government in England and for reserve matters, and the responsibility of the devolved governments in Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales. So we're going to hear from representatives of those governments later when we introduce the panel, and where we'll hear very briefly about their plans for implementation. But to set the scene really for the next presentation, each of the countries are developing their own strategies and delivery plans and are at different stages in their development. In England, the new Environmental Improvement Plan, EIP 23, was published earlier this year, and Welsh Government will be updating their Natural Resources Action Plan. Scottish Government consulted in September on its biodiversity strategy and the associated delivery plan. And DERA have previously consulted on their environment strategy and are developing a nature strategy alongside this. So these strategies and others contain ambitious commitments to support nature recovery. And I think we're really seeing a sort of strong support across the UK, with nature recovery being really high up the agendas of each country. So building on all this country level activity, all 4 countries have agreed to a joined up process in response to the GBF in support of implementation, in support of monitoring and reporting. And this really recognises the strength of devolved implementation alongside coordinated activities at UK level. So this might be, for example, where there are economies of scale in evidence provision or sharing what works well. So many of the issues each country faces are similar. So it's really good that we can learn from each of the different approaches each country is taking and learn what works. So today's a chance for our stakeholders to hear about this joint UK response to the GBF, which is going to lead to our UK NBSAP, and I'll let Willow introduce what that hideous acronym is. But please note that in addition to this, there are opportunities for engagement on the country strategies and delivery plans run by the UK government and the devolved governments. So there's multiple opportunities for stakeholders to engage as the countries develop their own commitments, targets towards the GBF. So that's all from me, and I'll hand over to Willow Outhwaite.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Claire. So great to see everyone here today. Really grateful for you spending your time with us this afternoon. My name's Willow Outhwaite, and I'm in the International Advice team at JNCC, and I'm leading the coordination of the UK NBSAP. So very excited to have you all here to talk about that today. So let's get this acronym out of the way, NBSAP, because it is a horrible one. I'm sure many of you have come across it, but just in case you haven't, NBSAP stands for National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan. And an obligation to produce some kind of national strategy is actually built into the convention itself. So if you take a look at the convention text within Article 6, it states that parties should develop national strategies, plans or programmes for the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity or adapt existing ones. And what a national strategy really should do is reflect how each country intends to fulfil the objectives of the convention. Because if you think we have 196 parties to CBD, all have totally different geographies, biodiversity, socio-economic situations, there is no one size fits all. So what an NBSAP does is reflects how each country will fulfil CBD in line with its specific national circumstances. Now, if you follow CBD quite closely, you'll know that COP15 happened in December last year. And alongside the GBF being adopted, parties also adopted this enhanced approach to planning, monitoring, reporting and review at COP15. So parties have kind of, I guess, learned some of the lessons of the Aichi target and got a much stronger plan, a much stronger mechanism in place to make sure things are on track to achieve the GBF, which is fantastic, to be honest. And part of this included parties agreeing to update their NBSAPs ahead of COP16, which is currently planned for October next year, to update their NBSAPs to reflect the GBF. And as Claire was just mentioning there, each of the 4 UK countries is in the process of doing that, right, as we speak. And part of them updating their country strategies has involved consultation with the public. So I'm sure many of you in the various organisations and companies you represent have taken part in some of that consultation. And those country strategies are being updated to have new commitments in there that reflect those 23 GBF targets and goals. Parties also agreed at COP to use a standardised template to outline their national targets, which will help them deliver against the GBF. And if you're interested to see what that national target template looks like, you can take a look in Decision 15.6, and I think my colleague Chiara is going to helpfully put the link into the chat. So you can take a look at that template in the decision and see what structure it takes and the fields that it contains. So you'll get an idea of the information that will go into that. So having individual country strategies for each of the 4 countries is fantastic and totally necessary, because each country strategy is going to lay out the action that each individual country will take out specific to their circumstances. So what will Scotland take that's action Scotland will take specific in the Scottish context? But it is the UK that's a contracting party to CBD, and it's the UK that's responsible for reporting on progress to implement the GBF. And the question that gets asked a lot, and I'm sure will get asked more and more, is what is the UK's contribution to the GBF? So having a UK level NBSAP makes it a lot easier to answer that question than it would be if we just had 4 individual country strategies. And what's been a very nice bonus of having this process to create an NBSAP, if we've developed a process for the 4 countries to define how they will work together to achieve the GBF. And Claire was touching a little bit on that. So the 4 countries can work together in a whole load of different ways. They can share ideas, best practices, lessons learned, what works well in one country, what doesn't work very well, and they'll warn the other countries against trying it, or at least changing some things about it. Or they could work together on some quite specific technical problems that need to be overcome. And one area where this is going to be really useful is around indicators, because there's a lot of work that needs to be done to overcome some very difficult technical questions on that. And if we have the brains of all 4 countries working together, it's we will achieve more than if just single countries try and take on that challenge. But I really do want to push home a point that having a UK level NBSAP does not in any way replace the individual strategies from the 4 countries. What it will do, and I'll try and explain that in the next few slides, is it will draw on those 4 individual strategies, as well as UK level strategies like the UK Marine Strategy, and synthesize into one document what the UK as a whole is doing to achieve the GBF. So it's not replacing individual strategies in any way, and it is certainly not preventing individual countries taking any action they wish to. So just wanted to make that point quite clear. So a couple of words on how we're producing the NBSAP. JNCC have spent a fair amount of time reading all the very many policies that each of the countries has around anything to do with nature, and that can be quite broad really. It can be the biodiversity strategies, but also strategies and policies related to climate change, pollution, the marine environment and all the different aspects of that, to peatland. And we've read all of these strategies and policies and been through with a fine-tooth comb and extracted any kind of commitment that those documents contain that will help deliver in one way or another one of the GBF targets. But this has resulted, as you can imagine, in us having thousands of commitments, and we don't want to include thousands of commitments in the UK NBSAP. It just doesn't make sense. It would be very hard to have an NBSAP of thousands of commitments to actually, for the reader to understand what it is that the UK is doing, what the UK's ambition is. So we've worked very closely with the 4 countries to select a subset of what we're calling priority commitments. So we've taken from thousands of commitments and gone down to the low hundreds. And this subset of priority commitments, they demonstrate the ambition that the UK as a whole has for achieving each of the 23 targets. It's not to say that some commitments are more important than others. It's just to say that some commitments are better at demonstrating the UK's ambition in achieving the GBF. So we'll take these priority commitments and then we are mapping them against each of the GBF targets that they contribute towards in the UK NBSAP. So as I mentioned, the UK NBSAP is not going to contain these many thousands of commitments. It's going to contain these priority commitments that demonstrate the UK's ambition. It's also going to act as a one-stop shop, signposting readers towards the most relevant strategies or policies or programmes of work that the UK has, which are really going to drive delivery of the GBF, and also towards specific policy measures that will help with particular targets. Now, I've spoken a lot about the 4 metropolitan UK countries, but just to say really that there will be detail within the UK's NBSAP on what some of the UK's overseas territories and crown dependencies are doing. And DEFRA has led on a separate process where they've consulted the OTs and CDs and asked for their contributions to include within the NBSAP. So you'll see something around the what's going on in the OTs and CDs, and including will signpost towards the UK Overseas Territory Biodiversity Strategy, which is currently in development and will be published next year. But more broadly, kind of stepping away from the specific strategies and the particular priority commitments, what the NBSAP should do is raise awareness of what the UK as a whole is doing to implement the GBF. And it should demonstrate how the 4 countries are cooperating to achieve the GBF. And that will be some of the examples I was just mentioning about sharing lessons and working together on particular technical issues. So the UK's NBSAP is going to take the format of there will be a main report with the following sections. So within the context section, we'll have something around major threats to the UK's biodiversity, some of those outcomes from COP15 that are relevant here, an explanation of how environmental policy is devolved within the UK, and also something to explain the UK's approach to filling out or to completing an NBSAP. It will then move on to signposting towards those major relevant strategies or policies, say something around the shared priorities of the 4 countries and give examples of how they're working together. And we'll also have a section on there which explains what the UK's approach to measuring implementation of the GBF is. So what is our approach to indicators? What type of indicators are we using? What process are we going through to select them? And then as an annex to this main report will be the completed national target templates. So you remember they are the templates that parties agreed they would all use in a standardised way. So we're going to annex them to the NBSAP, and there will actually be 23 copies of the national targets which reflect each one of the GBF targets. So if you're really interested in the detail on what the UK is doing on a target by target basis, you're going to want to look in the annex, because that's where you'll find the priority commitments by target, the indicators by target, and also those specific policy measures that can help deliver that target. You might also be aware that within the national target template, there is an optional field to include non-state actor commitments. And the UK has taken the approach of not including any commitments in there, but instead directing the reader towards the Sharm el-Sheikh to Kunming-Montreal Action Agenda for Nature and People, which helpfully has been abbreviated to Action Agenda, if they want to find out more about what non-state actors are doing within the UK to contribute towards the GBF. And the reason the UK has taken this approach is because there is so much going on from NGOs, companies, academia, across the whole civil society. There is so much going on to contribute towards the GBF. It just would not be possible to include them all. And if we sought to include some, a subsection, we would end up being biased in some way. So you could imagine you might end up with only those commitments from big organisations or from those organisations that have an open dialogue with government. So the government is more likely to hear about their commitments. And to be honest, that just isn't fair to include only a biased subset. So the UK has taken this approach, and we really do encourage non-state actors to add their commitments to the action agenda. Despite the long name of it, it's actually very simple to add your contribution, and it's in line with Decision 15.6, which I think Chiara again will add the link to find the action agenda to the chat, because it's in Decision 15.6 where NGOs, research organisations, the business and finance community are invited to develop commitments or help deliver on an NBSAP or towards the GBF more broadly, and upload them to the online platform. So it's right there in the decision that this is the place for non-state actors to be adding their contributions. There's also a field in the template where we will detail the indicators that we're going to use to measure implementation. So alongside adoption of the GBF, there was also an associated monitoring framework that was adopted at the same time. And this contains different types of indicators. So we've got the headline indicators that all parties need to use. So the UK will be reporting against the headline indicators. Then we've got these component and complementary indicators. Now, these are optional indicators that parties can kind of pick and choose based on their particular circumstances. And that's exactly what the UK will be doing. And we're going through a process right now of selecting which ones we're going to use. And we can also use national indicators to help fill any gaps that we want to monitor progress on. So JNCC is working really closely with the 4 countries and working on an initial list of the indicators that are going to be used. And as part of this process, we've identified gaps where indicators don't exist, but we know we want one. And we're starting to do this prioritisation around which gaps to fill first. And the way those indicators will be agreed is through a group called the 4-Country Biodiversity Group. And I'll say a bit more about that group on my next slide. So this is the governance model that's controlling how the NBSAP will be ultimately produced. So you'll see JNCC sitting right at the bottom, but don't let that mean anything to you, because we are the secretariat of the 4-Country Biodiversity Group. And that group is comprised of representatives from the governments of the 4 countries. And that group has a mandate to take forward substantive issues common to all 4 countries, including coordinating collective achievement of the MEAs, which means CBD2. And this is why it's the correct group really to be working through. So in our role as secretariat, we coordinate engagement between the 4 countries that will ultimately, hopefully, end up with us having a UK NBSAP. So we coordinate the 4 countries to get agreement on what the NBSAP should include, what format it should take, how we're going to fill out those national target templates, and we're leading on drafting the text itself. But while we can drive delivery, it's up to the 4-country biodiversity group itself to make the decisions, and they're very much in the driving seat of how this whole process is being operated. So they are agreeing the structure and content, but they're providing direction to JNCC on how everything should work on a regular basis, and they'll be reviewing the NBSAP text when we've produced it. Now, sitting above the 4-country biodiversity group is the Senior Officials Programme Board, and this is the highest official level forum for engagement between the 4 administrations across the EFRA portfolio. And then sitting right at the top is the Interministerial Group for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. And this is the highest portfolio level engagement forum between ministers of the 4 UK countries. And it's this group, the IMG, that have ultimate responsibility for production and publication of the NBSAP. And both the IMG and the Senior Official Programme Board receive updates on how their NBSAP is progressing, so they're kept very much abreast of how things are going. Now, I'm just going to use my last 2 slides to say a bit more about how we're going to get to a point of being able to launch the NBSAP. So we've spent a few months really getting a lot of the preparatory work done. So agreeing what will be in the NBSAP, what it will look like, going through those very many policies and strategies to find out what it is that the countries are committing to doing, mapping where indicators and data sets exist and looking at any gaps. We're now in this second stage of prioritising which of the many thousands of commitments to include, so which will be considered priority commitments. We're having today's virtual information event, which is a chance for us to speak to an external audience and let you all know how this is working. We also had an indicator workshop last week, which has made great progress on deciding which indicators we'll be using. And then looking forward, what the process is JNCC will draft the NBSAP. It will be reviewed through the 4-country biodiversity group. It will then go for ministerial sign-off and be launched in May next year. And if we launch it in May next year, that's well ahead of COP16, which is the deadline for updating your NBSAP. And yeah, as I mentioned, that's hopefully planned for October. So finally, just to focus mine probably more than anyone's, is it's going to be the next couple of months are going to be very busy on getting this NBSAP in good shape. So we will complete the first draft by this side of Christmas, which leaves the 4-country biodiversity group January to review it. We will update it based on their comments and provide an updated version in February, which they will then review by mid-March. So you can see we're actually getting to the point of getting quite close to publishing it. So that's everything I wanted to say. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you ever so much, Willow. Hopefully everyone on the call, and I'm delighted to see we've got a few more of you since I started. Hopefully you will all be able to understand a little bit better the process we've been going through here, and to see that it is inherently very complex and very complicated as well. So it does take a little bit of time to bring together, and I think everyone from our end has huge thanks to Willow and the team for pulling that together. We are now moving on to the Q&A section, the panel section. We were going to just see if there's any questions which are more technical in nature, just to get clarity on what we've just said now, and then we'll proceed to have a panel of representatives of all 4 governments of the UK to discuss some of the more policy questions there. Looking through the questions, I think the one that we will answer now, but I think we'll put the rest to the panel to have a more broader discussion. But one which I think is quite useful just to refer to now is Ruth Chambers has asked, what engagement are you planning on the UK NBSAP apart from today, of course? And I think it's important to reiterate the countries are engaging stakeholders through development of their plans, and the UK NBSAP is drawing on these plans, and we're committed to being very transparent about this process. But the majority of that consultation will be at the country level as the countries develop through that, and we're going to be considering what further consultation, information, engagement we do around that overarching UK NBSAP level. But we would really welcome any comments you may have, both yourself, Ruth, and attendees more broadly. If you could provide any reflections on what consultation you would like to see moving forward to inform our decision making there. But as I said, most of that is going to be from the perspective of the 4 countries. But do feed back to us on that. I don't think we have any more sort of technical questions around that, so we can probably move to the panel. And I just see one question, just a couple just came in there, just checking, conferring with my colleagues. So Elena Bellestri, will there be consultation on the NBSAP before publishing? Hopefully my answer there has just given you some clarity about our thinking around that, but we can always come back to that if you want more. And Rob, that's probably a bit more of a technical question. So Willow, when do you have to first start reporting against the targets, as publishing the NBSAP is just one of the targets? That's from Rob Stoneman of the Wildlife Trust, sir.
Great. Yeah, thank you very much for that question. So as part of this enhanced monitoring, reviewing, etc. mechanism, countries need to put their 7th national report in by February 2026, and then there'll be an 8th national report in 2029. So it'll be that 7th national report in early 2026 will be where we first report progress on how we're doing. Thanks.
Thank you, Willow. Hopefully that answers that question, Rob. I'm now going to introduce our panel, but before I do that, I'm going to reiterate the House rules again. So we have a good sort of 40-50 minutes for discussion, so hopefully we've got enough time. To remind ourselves, the cameras and mics will be off, but we may turn your camera and your mic on to introduce your question. Please do upvote any questions, and just to reiterate, questions go in the Q&A. Please do upvote, as it will help us assess which questions we put directly there. And I think that's it from the housekeeping. I haven't seen anything else from my colleagues, so I've got another screen here of colleagues advising bits and pieces. So with that, I will introduce our panel. So today we are, yes, and if the panel can turn on their cameras as well, that would be much appreciated. So today we are very fortunate to have representatives from all 4 countries, as well as officials from JNCC who are helping in the development of this UK NBSAP. So we have, I will introduce each panel member in turn, and then each panel member, you can just say a little bit about who you are and your engagement. So I will turn to Will Lockhart first, who's Deputy Director of International Biodiversity and Wildlife at DEFRA. Hello, Will.
Thanks so much, Danny, and everyone at JNCC. Afternoon, everyone. Nice to see you all. My name's Will. Well, Danny's told you what my job title is. I was the lead negotiator for the UK at COP15. So you've got me to blame for all that quite dense UN language, but hopefully some UN language that masks some really positive things. It's great to be here. Maybe I'll save a little bit more for later. I think I'm just introducing myself, aren't I, Danny? So I'll stop.
Thank you, Will. Next over to Lisa McCann at Scottish Government.
Thanks, Danny, and thanks for inviting us along today. So my name's Lisa McCann. I'm the head of the Biodiversity Unit within the Scottish Government. We currently have a consultation on our overarching biodiversity framework, and I'd just take this opportunity to encourage everyone to have a look at that consultation, which is particularly relevant to everything we're discussing today. Thanks.
Thanks, Lisa. I'll now introduce Alice from the Welsh Government.
Thanks, Danny. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks also for inviting me to be on the panel today. I'm Alice Teague. I'm a Deputy Director in Welsh Government, and my division covers marine and biodiversity. And on the marine side, it covers things like marine planning and licensing. So it's looking at, how we sustainably use our seas. Thanks.
Thank you, Alice. Over to Sarah from the Northern Irish Government.
Afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Danny. I'm here alongside my colleague Ken Bradley from the Northern Ireland perspective. My role is as Chief Scientist within Northern Ireland Environment Agency, Natural Environment Division, covering all aspects of terrestrial and freshwater biodiversity. So I'm working closely with policy colleagues, with Ken and his team, to try and see how we take forward the Northern Ireland perspective of global biodiversity framework. But over to Ken.
Thank you, starting for that glowing introduction. I'll have to repay that compliment. No, Ken Bradley, Policy Officer within the Department of Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs. As Sarah said, I'm on the policy side, looking after, obviously, the biodiversity strategy, or as we call it in Northern Ireland, the nature recovery strategy to 2032. That's one of our policy asks, shall we say. Also involved in the Wildlife Order, conservation regs, Ivory Act, invasive species, GMOs, etc., 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 with a team of 6 people. So obviously we're spread exceedingly thin on the ground, and our marine colleagues unfortunately aren't here this afternoon, which cover things like marine protected areas and things like that there. Okay.
Thank you, Ken. I think Willow's introduced herself previously, so Joe, over to you.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm Joe Taylor. I'm Biodiversity Indicators Manager at JNCC. And in my role, I coordinate the review of indicators in response to the GBF, and also coordinate the process around selecting indicators for the national target template. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Joe. And before we get cracking with the questions, I'm just going to hand over to Will for a couple of words there.
Goodness me, what a responsibility. Well, good morning, good afternoon. I don't even know what time of day it is. I'm so shocked. No, that's not true. I guess I just wanted to take a step back and put all this in the context of Montreal, which, you know, a huge number of you on the call, you know, I can see your names. You were there, you know, as well as I do. You know, it was quite a sort of a transformative and ambitious set of outcomes. And I really think that on the UK side, we were lucky to have such support from our kind of civil society, you know, and NGO and business colleagues. It was fantastic. I think, you know, coming out of Montreal, we've all sort of, I think we're all struck by the huge sense of ambition that was there in Montreal and the huge amount of work that we have to do. You know, you can measure that in a huge number of ways. You know, it's work in terms of investment, it's work in terms of policy directions and policy decisions, and it's work in terms of the kind of thing that Willow and the team at JNCC have been doing so hard on. I mean, I guess sharing a couple of perspectives from the England perspective, and you know, my colleagues will want to talk more about this, I'm sure. I mean, we found it really interesting coming out of Montreal, and sort of taking quite a good look at our plumbing, our sort of Whitehall plumbing for environment policy, and thinking about what opportunities does you know, the KMGBF and actually the NBSAP as well, what opportunities does that give us to sort of rewire some of the stuff that we do in government and in Whitehall, some of the boards and some of the structures, and how does that all work? I mean, you all work in organisations, you know how important that is, and we've really had opportunities there, and we found that doors have opened, and we've been able to look at setting up new relationships and new processes, which I think is hugely beneficial and helpful. Of course, that stuff, you know, it's quite difficult to make public. It's not the kind of stuff you publish things about. But you know, some of the public stuff, we continue in England, and I know that my colleagues do as well, to engage with you all in different ways, and you know, get your views. And then of course, we've just been doing, and we'll get onto this in a moment, but all of the things that we've been doing as England, you know, looking at the environmental improvement plan and all the various strategies that support there. So you know, we've been busy. It continues to be busy. We've got to publish an NBSAP in good time ahead of COP16, right? Now, we don't quite know where COP16 is going to be yet, but we know that it's going to happen at the end of October. And we know that we want to be a part of that process, right? We know that we want the NBSAP to be considered as part of this aggregation exercise that Willow talked about. So we're keen to keep moving forward. We don't want to rush, but we need to move forward with pace. And we want to make sure that the NBSAP is really one of the top, you know, this needs to lead the pack, right? So we've set ourselves a clear ambition, both in terms of quality and timeline. And I think this part of this process is just about making that happen. Thanks, Danny.
Thanks, Will, for providing that perspective. If the panelists are agreeable, I suggest we move on to the questions. Does that sound okay? Wonderful. Okay, so I'm being fed questions on the side here, so apologies for looking slightly away from the camera. First question I'm looking at here is sorry, too many screens and too many things flying around. Will you, so this one's from Lydia Colas, hopefully I've got that right. Will you identify gaps where the UK does not have sufficient policies to deliver the GBF? Willow, maybe I'll come to you first to answer that, and then we'll broaden it out to the country perspectives on there.
Sure, yes, so thank you for the question. Technically, within the NBSAP, how it will look is you'll be able to see the priority commitments that each of the countries are making, I guess, against each of the 23 targets. So I guess if there's no priority commitment against a particular aspect of a target, then you'll be able to identify the gap there. But we're working very closely with the 4 countries at the moment. I think this kind of adds to a question someone else had asked, working very closely with the 4 countries at the moment to try and get coverage across all components of all of the targets. But we're in the midst of that work right now, so I can't tell you if we've got any gaps because we won't have finished that work for a couple of weeks. Hope that answers your question. Thanks.
Thank you, Willow. Does anyone from the countries want to elaborate any further on that? So to reiterate, that was, will you identify gaps where the UK does not have sufficient policies to deliver the GBF?
I'm not going to do this on every question, I promise, but I saw this question in the chat and I think it's such a good one, so I can't help myself. I guess one of the things that's quite new, I think we should be quite open with you all about it, is this process, right? Is this this forum and this process and cooperating in this way. We work together, well, as described, you know, with JNCC and my colleagues from around the UK on all sorts of issues. But this is quite new for us, and it's really interesting. And I think Willow's given a really good answer as to whether or not it will identify gaps. We're all kind of on that journey. It's going to be really interesting to see what this process and the aggregation activity actually shows us. And I think you know, that will serve, and that was the whole purpose of the CBD and the plan out to 2030 and then the plan out to 2050, is that, you know, if there are gaps, you know, that will give us quite a clear indication of the kind of areas of activity that we might need to focus on in the medium and long term. Thanks.
Thanks, Will. Any of the other panelists want to chip in there? No? Okay, we'll move on to the next question there. The next question I've got here is, are the commitments in the NBSAP designed to add up to ensuring the UK as a whole is nature positive, therefore halting and reversing the loss of biodiversity by 2030? And in the hope that they are, how will you be able to fully plan, track and report this, if not also including non-state actor commitments, as this would seem a big gap? Who wishes to tackle that first? So we're asking there, does the NBSAP add up to a whole for the UK? Go on, Willow, do you want to provide a technical perspective there? I can see your...
Yes, certainly, I can give you a technical response. So kind of exactly what Will was just saying is this is our first time of running it in this manner to see what the UK as a whole, so the 4 different countries as a whole, are committing to. And you might recall from Claire's presentation, the 4 countries are all at different stages of agreeing their commitments as well. But ultimately, what should come out is we will have in place the UK's commitments against the GBF targets. So you will be able to see what that adds up to, what the UK's ambition is. So the NBSAP will be a very good evidence base for answering that question of what does this add up to, really. So that's my technical response. I might turn it over to other panelists to add on to that if they wish.
Thank you, Willow. Any other panelists want to have a crack at that? Ken.
I'll probably regret this, but I suppose that, yes, there's 2 parts to that question. And yes, Willow's very helpful presentation earlier on set out the sort of scene in relation to the UK-wide system or process. and each of the 4 countries feeding in that. So our nature recovery strategy, our biodiversity strategy, it tries to address all the 23 GBF targets. Obviously, some are better addressed than others, albeit all in draft. And then because our strategy sits under the Environmental Improvement Plan, there's an obligation then to report on that every year. So obviously, those targets will be reported on. Then obviously is it 26, I think, Willow or Daniel, keep right, that we then report as the UK as well. So there's a lot of reporting, a lot of gathering evidence, a lot of transparency there in the whole process, I think.
Thanks, Ken. Will?
Yeah, well, it's quite a similar answer really to Ken. I mean, I think so in England, you all know very well, we've had the 25-year environment plan and then the environmental improvement plans, which sort of, iterate that. They simultaneously report on and iterate that, don't they? And then we've got our Environment Act targets, which include, sort of medium term and then interim targets. And obviously the apex target there is the species, is the species target, which speaks to the point around iterate that. They simultaneously report on and iterate that, don't they? And then we've got our Environment Act targets, which include sort of medium term and then interim targets. And obviously the apex target there is the species is the species target, which speaks to the point around halting and reversing biodiversity loss by 2030. So we have at an England level, I think, quite a kind of a clear structure for aiming to halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030. I mean, I think it was Noel that asked this question. Noel, we talked about this in the past. I mean, what does that mean in terms of being nature positive? That's a different thing, and a much more complicated and interesting thing. And that's when you bring in all the targets that we're so passionate about, like target 15, target 14 on mainstreaming, targets, on targets 20, 21, 22, and 23 on the involvement of all kinds of different groups. I mean, I was struck looking at the work that we've produced for England on the really strong narrative we've got across all of those pieces. So there's a lot going on there. We need to see where that comes out when, we aggregate that up to the UK level. But I'm cautiously optimistic that the UK can tell a really, really positive story across the kind of the 2030 mission. Thanks.
Thanks, Will. Over to Lisa.
Thanks. So I thought it might be helpful to mention the logic modelling process that we went through in Scotland in developing our draft biodiversity delivery plan. So I'll put a link in the chat to the methodology for this, but basically we asked a group of experts to try to outline the key actions that would need to be taken in order to halt biodiversity loss by 2030 and reverse declines by 2045. That went through several iterations, and those actions are now what is included in our draft delivery plan that we are consulting on. I think in respect of non-state actions, we have slightly toiled with how best do you incorporate those within a delivery plan. Within our delivery plan, we have focused on the actions that can be taken by government and government agencies. We recognise it's incredibly important that we work across government, outside of government, and with all of the key delivery partners. But we need to be able to report on the actions in the delivery plan. We need to be held accountable within government for those. And we can't include actions that we are not directly responsible for. So I think it's a really good question. And what I would say is something we are still, within Scotland, struggling how best to incorporate within our delivery plans. But we are working really closely with all of those delivery partners to make sure that we have a shared understanding of ambitions and where we can collaborate and work best together. Thanks.
Thank you, Lisa. I'll hand over to Alice in Wales now.
Thanks, Danny. So at the moment, we are in the process of consulting on our Nature Recovery Action Plan, which is our equivalent of the NBSAP. But we are also about to launch a white paper, which will put onto a legislative footing statutory nature targets in Wales, put our NBSAP on a statutory footing, and an enhanced duty for Welsh ministers and other public bodies to implement the NBSAP and report against that. So that is due out in January. So we're kind of working furiously on that at the moment. In relation to the sort of the requirements, the duties will be on public bodies, public authorities, but we will also, for example, as Welsh Government, look at how we can promote some of these targets through other schemes and programmes that we have. So our sustainable farming scheme, we're going to be consulting on that next month, I believe. So looking at how we incentivise, encourage, better land management use through schemes such as that. Also looking at, other programmes in which we use our public funding, procurement, all sorts of things, so that we try and engage as wide a range of actors in our delivery as possible.
Thanks, Alice. I realise I've made a mistake and I didn't invite the questioners to invite the question themselves for the previous two, so I apologise to our last couple of questioners. But for our next question, I am going to turn to Mark Johnson. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you much. Pretty much, Danny. So I've forgotten the question now, but anyway, I just wondered first of all you could expand on whether the NBSAP will actually include the role of businesses in delivering some of the actions or delivering the targets for the NBSAP, for the Global Biodiversity Framework. Thank you.
Who would like to tackle that for Willow?
Sorry, I jumped in to tackle that. Thank you very much for your question. So as I mentioned, contributions from any non-state actor, including businesses, are best put through the action agenda. So the NBSAP itself won't include a lot of detail on what businesses are doing that will contribute towards the GBF. Instead, really do encourage you to put your contributions within the action agenda. What the NBSAP will include is detail on consultation or stakeholder engagement there's been when developing the 4-country biodiversity strategies and also the NBSAP itself. So I'm sure that will touch on business as well if you've been involved in any deep dives or anything like that, but no specific business commitments will be in it. Thank you.
Thanks, Willow. Any further reflections on that from the 4 countries? No, that's okay. Mark, that wasn't actually the question. I don't think you put in the chat in the Q&A. I can give you, if you want, I can give you a second opportunity to put the original question. Very cheeky, trying to get an extra question there, but we'll allow it once.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Danny. No, the other question was in terms of whether the actual NBSAP will include any additional commitments or actions which are not already covered in the 25-year environment plan or the environment improvement plan.
Thanks, Mark. Maybe I'll go over to Will for 25-year environment plan question.
Yeah, so that's an England question, exactly. So it will. So we'll draw on. Hi, Mark. So we'll draw on a huge range of different strategies. I mean, this has been one of the really interesting things, reviewing the sort of huge range of government commitments out there. Is that government departments, ministers, successive governments have been making commitments about biodiversity in all sorts of different places for quite a long time, and so it's actually very instructive to bring them together both at an England level and then at a national level. So we've got obvious ones are ones like the UK Marine Strategy and then the Fisheries Act, the sort of DEFRA ones but slightly wider, but then you've also got all sorts of things on the resource mobilisation and the business side coming out of Treasury, DBT, Bays, different kinds of business departments, different names of business department. We've got lots of targets on nature, both in terms of raising private finance and then both in terms of sort of mobilising domestic finance too. So we're not just looking at those two things. We're looking at all sorts of documents, all sorts of pledges, all sorts of budget announcements, all sorts of things, and bringing it all together to try and tell the national story. The EIP did do some of that, right? The EIP did draw in some of those strategies, particularly on planning, of course, biodiversity net gain and things like that. But I think because of the sort of transformative nature of the GBF, this is trying to go even wider. Thanks.
Thanks, Will, there. I think the next question we're going to is one from Fiona Dobson next. Fiona, I think your mic might be on now.
Yes, thank you so much. I asked two, but I think it's the one that has the most likes that I will ask here. I think you've started to answer some of this, so thank you already, but it's about how can we be reassured that the NBSAP won't just be a rehash of existing commitments? We already started thinking about gaps. If there are gaps, is there a process to fill those to make sure that the NBSAP really does deliver the UK's contribution to the new global targets, given that some of the consultation, for example, was done pre-COP15? What's the sort of space for new commitments to make sure we meet those global targets? Thanks so much.
Thanks, Fiona. Does anyone want to start that off there from the 4 countries, or shall I pick on someone? How about Wales? You smiled the largest when I said I'll pick on someone. So
must look more miserable in future. I think it's an excellent question. And Fiona, nice to see you. I think we met out in Montreal. I mean, it absolutely needs to include sort of new commitments. And you know, that is the ambition of Wales. I mean, obviously we need to be pragmatic about you know, sort of what is achievable and deliverable. So you know, sort of setting out you know, sort of ways in which we're going to deliver things that we know we've got no chance of delivering. Just, you know, this is my own personal opinion, it's not a ministerial opinion, just it's not, I don't, we want to be genuine in what we're trying to do. So it's being ambitious, it's looking at how we can you know, sort of drive that lasting change, but saying things like we're going to invest 200 million in this, you know, it's just, it wouldn't be truthful or accurate. So you know, we're looking at creative ways in which we can build on what we've already got in place, expand those things, you know, shamelessly steal what the other countries around the UK are doing and is working well, and adapt them where we can for Wales, but also looking at where we, you know, where we are best placed to do some of these collectively, so where that UK response is really needed, as opposed to at the, you know, sort of at the individual country level.
thank you, Alice. Anyone else like to provide a response to Fiona there? Ken.
Thanks, Danny, and thanks, Fiona. As you say, you know, COP15 is when the biodiversity framework was agreed, although we knew it was in draft for several years before, because obviously the COVID-19, the COP15 kept getting postponed. So we had a good idea of what was the bones of the to be agreed, and we took the decision to work, as we call it, co-design process with our main stakeholders in devising our new nature recovery strategy, because we were heavily criticised, you know, our previous strategy just being really a compendium of activities which the department and other government bodies and public bodies were actually doing, and which collectively may not and did not halt the loss of biodiversity. So we took the decision, yes, in trying to address all the 23 GBF goals or targets, to try and be innovative as possible. Now, those are obviously in a very draft form at the minute, and we haven't got agreement for a lot of it. But we felt, you know, we need to be, as you say, you know, look holistically, look at the whole framework, but see what needs to be done and how we can best do it. So that's really where we're at. So it is. A very good question, Fiona. Thank you.
Thanks, Ken. And over to Lisa now.
Thanks. I guess just really similar to what Ken has said, within our draft strategy and delivery plan in Scotland, we have taken into account the new global biodiversity framework. And the one point I wanted to make was we haven't so much focused on trying to do new things, but what we've really tried to focus on is accelerating the pace and the scale of what we're doing. We know what are the actions that need to be taken. We just knew we need to do more of it more quickly. And that's really been the focus of what we're trying to deliver.
Thanks, Lisa. We'll move on to another question now. Noelle, I realise I asked a bit of your question, but perhaps not all of your questions. Your question had a bit more about non-state actors there. So I think your camera's turned on now if you'd like to answer that, ask that question to the group.
Oh, I need to just click. Okay, sorry, I thought it came on automatically. Can you see me now?
We can hear you perfectly. We can't
Okay.
see you, but I would just
Okay.
ask your question anyway.
Sure, don't know why that's not working. Yeah, so I suppose just to follow up it, thinking about how we can kind of have our NBSAPs being a bit more like an NDC, not that that's exactly working perfectly, but how without being able to add in, you know, Mark's point about the private sector actions, without having this whole of society approach and being able to add together all those different commitments and actions and then be able to track those. It's quite difficult to do that stock take that we need in order to look at how's the UK contributing to the global goal, to the GBF mission, and then the same for any other country. So I guess I'm thinking about how we can move to a more kind of quantitative and spatially explicit NBSAP to help direct both, you know, planning and implementation and tracking of biodiversity across the whole territory. And so that's obviously not just sort of government actions, but it's the actions of everybody, of all the actors within the territory. And I get, yeah, it's sort of also we're very aware of the deadline and, you know, the need for urgent action to get the NBSAPs and the national targets nailed. But yeah, equally, we need to be thinking about, well, it's certainly a process then to how to sort of iteratively potentially incorporate things that maybe are not possible right now, but to think about how we kind of improve as we go along in terms of that quantitative, spatially explicit component. And for the UK, I mean, given where biodiversity is, the potential to bend the curve for the UK is really, really great. So, you know, leading by example, showing how we can deliver the action, but the science to help, you know, lead the way would be brilliant. So there's real potential for the UK to sort of show how we can deliver nature positive, but it is really, really complicated, and it's something we're thinking about. So yeah, be happy to talk more about this in a more technical sense at some point.
I think in the interest of time, we'll probably go to the panel now. So quite a lot in there, but does anyone from the panel want to reflect on any of that? Will?
Well, I'll take that one because Noel made a very kind offer, which was to keep working with us on it, and I think we'll take up on that. I mean, I think Lisa's answer to Lisa did pick up this part of the question earlier, I think, and I think she gave a great answer that, you know, it's quite difficult, isn't it? If you start getting into kind of listing, you know, the activities that are going on at even local authority level, let alone individual business or non-state actor level, it becomes really challenging to kind of track, and the accountability is quite difficult. There are kind of, you know, proxy metrics that you can use, right? So a really obvious one will be private finance that's mobilized for nature. And in the England context, you know, we'd be looking at things like biodiversity net gain and the emergence of that market. We'd be looking at, you know, other kinds of, you know, investment, you know, all sorts of different kinds. I won't list them all, we'll be here all day, but you know what I mean. So we'll definitely be using some of those proxy kind of metrics, I think. I think they'll be really important. And then you've got metrics that will speak to some of the targets, like target 15. We'll need to be thinking about how many businesses are moving towards disclosure models. We'll need to be looking at target 16, which is about, you know, consumption, and there's indicators there about global footprints. So there's all kinds of proxies. But I think, Noel, I basically agree with the thrust of your question, which is how to involve, you know, the non-state actor contribution in a really good NBSAP is a kind of a international, you know, brilliant homework question that we should all spend some time thinking about. Thanks.
Thanks, Will. Would anyone else like to respond to Noel there? Alice.
Thanks. And I mean, not so much on business, but just picking up Will's point about non-state actors. I mean, one of the things we're really keen to do in Wales is look at how we really get that widest range of possible voices heard when we consult on our NBSAP and action plan, so that we can engage them in our, you know, Team Wales approach to this. And particularly keen to, you know, to hear the voices of young people and those that just don't traditionally engage in this area at all. So we're looking at, you know, who the who the organisations, who the individuals are that we work through to hear some of those unheard voices. So, for example, you know, the Children's Commissioner for Wales, we have a piece of legislation called the Wellbeing of Future Generations, which is all about considering future generations when you're taking decisions. So working with that commissioner there, you know, working with, you know, sort of disadvantaged and deprived communities. So it really is that Wales approach, because we're in danger of otherwise only talking to those that we always engage with, which is incredibly helpful. And we've got a fantastic network in Wales, but we need to hear those voices that we don't normally hear.
Thanks, Alice. Anyone else like to respond to Noelle, or should we move on to another question? Ken. Sorry, Ken, you're on mute.
Someone said I should stay permanently on mute, but however, to try and answer your question more generally, I suppose when you talk about the business community, you know, I would think of also obviously the farmers, landowners, fishermen, people they got there, and obviously they're very key in this whole process. And as William said, you know, while we don't ask individual farmers or individual fishermen to give targets or to report those targets, a lot of government policies and initiatives drive, you know, where our farmers go and help, you know, to help it be more sustainable and more nature friendly, you know, within the Northern Ireland context. You know, we've got obviously the new agri-environment schemes rolling out in a few years' time, and the Farming with Nature initiative is part of that. So again, to try and, I suppose, steer landowners and people in the right direction, and that's therefore we have a sort of again, as William said, a sort of a proxy indicator or a proxy target, no, not directly for them to report on, but their achievements will hopefully then make a positive difference overall. If we have several thousand farmers, landowners, you know, helping biodiversity. And just on the point, Alice, on Wales, no one copies or pinches other people's ideas better than Northern Ireland. So that's a very, very good way to do business. So it is.
Thank you, Ken. I think we'll move on to a question from Annie Smith now. Annie, I think your camera and mic is activated. Thanks, Annie.
Hi there. Thank you. I think this question hooks back into a bit of the earlier discussion, actually, because I wrote it when we were hearing about the timetable for the UK NBSAP. And Alice, thank you. You sort of gave the information about what Wales is doing at the moment. And I know one of those things is like quite a lot of quite intense engagement around what goes into Wales's sort of revised nature recovery action plan. So I don't think that work is scheduled or planned to be sort of completed in the same time frame as the UK NBSAP. You might correct me. So I was just thinking there's obviously you know, the timing isn't perfectly aligned as you might expect, and how you know, any thoughts on how to bring that into line, I suppose, through the reporting or how that will work would be really interesting.
Thanks, Annie. Willow.
Yeah, so I can have a go answering this. You're right, the different timelines do not align perfectly, which is unfortunate, but the reality. So the NBSAP, it, as well as having the commitments from all of these strategies, it can also include from any of the 4 countries any commitment to make a commitment or any plans to make a commitment, because each of the 4 countries is going through their process, as you've heard right now, to update biodiversity strategies, but also other relevant strategies. So even if their commitment is not yet finalised, we can still pop something in the NBSAP about that. And then when it comes to reporting in 2026, hopefully the commitment will have been finalised by then. So just because it's not in the NBSAP at this stage and finalised, it doesn't mean we cannot report against it when it comes to national report in 2026. So I think that's kind of how we're looking at bridging those different timelines. Thanks.
Well, thank you. That's helpful.
Thanks, Willow. Over to Alice.
Thanks, Annie. Hi, Annie. Yeah, so just really sort of agreeing with what Willow said. You know, I think in terms of in time for next year, we're more likely to have a strategic approach in place, that kind of overarching, you know, these are our commitments, these are our priorities, with that detailed action plan then to follow, and that then aligns with the timing that we have for the white paper and the bill on environmental governance and targets as well. So you know, that we will then be able to include into that detailed sort of action planning, you know, the direction of travel for the targets that we're going to be bringing in as well.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Alice. Would anyone else like to provide any reflections down either? No? Okay. We'll move on to the next question. Annie, I do enjoy your background of the dragonfly wings. They are lovely. Our next question is from Paul Desiler. Paul, your camera and mic should be on.
Hello.
Hi.
Paul De Silva, Friends of the Earth. I'm just trying to find my question. What question did I ask? Oh, right. Yes. Thank you. I was wondering whether the NBSAP, JNCC, NBSAP would identify reasons or factors which may prevent or delay delivery. I ask that because we have had years and years of strategies being drawn up and then not delivered or going off track quite quickly. And unless a strategy or an action plan is clear about the environment in which it's operating, there's a high risk that the everyday politics or operation of government interdepartmental fighting will lead it to be delayed and go off track as well. So it would be really useful if there was a mechanism for or a dashboard for that to exist, because I'm not saying any of this is easy. I'm just saying there are lots of reasons why things don't happen as they look on paper, and there is a risk of this being another paper exercise, which I don't think anyone wants it to be. So is there a way of capturing the factors which may lean against delivery and success? Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, and apologies for the mispronunciation of your surname by myself there. Who would like to go first on that question?
It's an occupational hazard.
Well, my surname as well. Anyone? Will?
It's a very hard question, Paul. Congratulations. So I think probably not, right? I mean, I think it's, you know, at a factual level, like no, I don't think that anyone had thought about that. But it's a good challenge. And I mean, I guess taking a step back again, one of the intentions of moving, you know, I mean, yeah, like 11 months ago, we had NBSAPs, right? But NBSAPs, you know, and Willow explained very nicely that they're one of the obligations under the convention. But NBSAPs, one didn't necessarily do anything with NBSAPs, right? They were published. And I think the idea was that, you know, a country would publish their NBSAP, and then the expectation was that civil society, by and large, you know, in its broadest sense, would look at the NBSAP and would kind of, you know, use that as a tool with their respective national government, both to kind of track their sort of, to understand their intentions and work out whether they're good enough, and then to track their delivery of it. So to some extent, the NBSAP was, you know, designed to be this kind of, you know, this exercise of holding yourself to account. What we've added since, you know, December is this big international process, this big international machinery around the NBSAP. So all the NBSAPs will be kind of added together and aggregated up. There'll be a report that will be publicly available, you know, at intermittent sort of periods throughout the COP cycle. You know, there'll be discussions at COPs about how well we're doing. We've set up this whole kind of process of monitoring how we're doing against these things. So I don't think that there's at the moment a plan to have that specific point around potential, drags or risks. It's a really interesting challenge. But I do think you've got this huge new machinery around the NBSAP, which has a crucial role for all the people on this call, both at a global and national level, to really actually kind of critique how governments are doing, whether their promises are sufficient and whether they're keeping to their promises. So I think it's quite a big opportunity in that sense. And that just sparked as you were asking that question. So I hope that's helpful.
Thanks, Will. Thanks, Paul, for keeping us on our toes. Lisa, you're next.
Thanks. Yep. So one of the things that we did in our biodiversity strategy in Scotland was to try to identify what are the enabling conditions that we need to have in place for success, and what are the things that we haven't done in the past that has meant that we haven't achieved the biodiversity goals. We know what we've known for quite some time, what are the actions that we need to take, but why haven't those actions been taken? So looking to try to learn lessons from the past, we've identified certain kind of conditions for success or enabling factors that we think need to be in place. So things like having the right governance structure, which aligns with what Will was talking to, having the right kinds of public engagement and communication so that people really understand what the biodiversity crisis is and why it matters to them. So, there's a specific chapter within the Scottish Biodiversity Strategy which sets out in more detail the approach that we have taken in Scotland to really tackling that, to making sure that the high level ambition is actually able to be delivered.
Thanks, Lisa. Willow, and then Alice.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question, because it's a very important one. So in terms of all this big machinery Will is talking about, part of that is the 7th National Report, which is due, as I said, early Feb. And in that, every party is going to need to report on how we're getting on. So in the UK's NBSAP, the way we're presenting it, as I mentioned, is to have as an annex these completed national target templates. And in those national target templates, we're going to say what the priority commitments of each of the 4 countries are. Fast forward to February 2026, we're going to need to say how we're doing with them. Have we completed them? Are we on track? If not, why not? Because there is a section in that 7th National Report to say what are the challenges you're facing. So we don't actually have to wait too long in the world of MEAs, which normally drag on for a bit. We don't have to wait too long until we're reporting on it and assessing the progress. And what's quite nice about this enhanced monitoring process is it shines a spotlight on what is normally a domestic issue. It brings it to the international fora. There are commitments that might have only ever been in EIP. Well, now they're in a CBD document. So it brings a little more scrutiny to it. So I guess just to say, there is this process through CBD reporting where we will be reporting on progress and needing to define what our challenges are if we haven't met our commitments. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Willow. I'm going to come to Alice and Sarah in a second, just to say we are near the end, so we will take one more question after comments from Sarah and Alice, which will be from Gareth Morgan. But if you have any remaining questions, do put them in the text quickly before it ends, and we will try and get to those unanswered questions in writing later. But yes, sorry to interrupt the flow there. Going to Alice now.
Thanks, Danny. And thanks, Paul, for the question. I think one of the reasons that we are proposing to legislate in this area, not just for the targets, but to put the NBSAP on a statutory footing, as well as a requirement around monitoring and reporting and so on, is to, how do I put this in a diplomatic way, to prevent politics derailing this, essentially. It's to ensure that whatever future government, whatever future ministers we have, there is that sort of legal requirement to do this. And my minister has been really clear about why she wants to do that, so that they're in the way that net zero is there in legislation, that the sort of biodiversity targets and reporting and monitoring and so on are there in the same way. Absolutely agree with Lisa's point about the enabling factors. That will be really important, particularly given sort of budgetary pressures and so on at the moment. And one of the things that we will absolutely incorporate incorporate into ours, which we're beholden to do by this piece of legislation that I mentioned on the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, is set out the ways in which we work, so the ways in which we will develop the NBSAP, the ways in which we will deliver it. So that's, you know, long term, taking an integrated approach, collaboration, some others which I forget, but that requires us to work in a certain way, and we are held to account if we don't deliver, you know, sort of plans, strategies, and so on, or any piece of policy in that way.
Thank you, Alice, and over to Sarah.
Yeah, no, it is a really, really useful question. And again, I think, Danny, you maybe referred to this earlier. I think there's been a lot of lessons learned from the ACHI targets or failure to deliver against most of them. And that's where the Global Biodiversity Framework, I think, and what has been set out on those various parts of the framework, I think means that some of those checks and balances around what is required to put in place those enabling conditions and address some of those pressures and threats that weren't necessarily addressed through ACHI. So, you know, making sure that we have provisions in place around addressing pollution and any of those other factors that would significantly undermine any of our conservation efforts. So I think that whole theory of change and framework itself, and the fact that we actually have to map commitments against all of those across the 23 targets, I think will provide us with, I think, a really good check and balance across this, because, you know, and I think it's something that will also have to be taken into account as we build business cases for funding programs. You know, what other steps or other policies need to be closely aligned, which, whenever you look at biodiversity policy, means everything else, you know, even within our department and across government, needs to be closely aligned here. So I think there's enough checks there, and Willow and others and Joe will be keeping us on our toes in terms of the whole monitoring reporting framework. I think there will be much more transparency to ensure that all of those other issues and factors that may have affected delivery will need to be addressed, or it will be clear where they're not being addressed and have to be worked on.
Thank you, Sarah. I said we'd have one more question. I think we are a little bit tight on time, but maybe what I'll do is I'll read that question out and give a minute, 30 seconds to a minute to Will to answer it, because I think it's a challenge to end on, but I think it's quite an interesting one to explore. So I'll ask you that question, but I'll just do a very quick wrapping up. But the question is from Gareth Morgan: does the panel think that governments knew the consequences of what they were signing up to in what is a fairly ambitious agreement? Or are governments assuming that it won't really bind them? Apologies to put you on the spot, Will.
No, not at all, and the lights have turned off. So I'm certain that they knew what they were signing up to, because I explained it to them a lot, and not just my government, but lots of other governments too. And I do think that the hope, the kernel, the positive bit of Montreal was that they realised this and they accepted they needed to do it. But I think what they also accept, and what we as 4 countries accept, is that the process of kind of drafting our first NBSAP is a kind of a learning journey that we're going to go on. And, you know, it's really positive that we're having this session and learning from each other and listening to you all. So I don't think that they're hoping that they're just going to get away with it. But I also think that, you know, we're going to learn as we go, and that's going to be really, really positive. Thanks.
Thanks, Will. And if I had one final reflection, as someone who was lucky enough to go to COP14 and COP15, the change in tone, atmosphere, energy between those 2 COPs was chalk and cheese. And I think that absolutely reflects the sentiment that Will was sharing there. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. There's been some fascinating questions and great discussion there. I wish we could go on longer. What we have done is we have captured all the questions that have not been answered, and we are going to look to try and respond to them separately outside of this. This has been recorded, and I think is still being recorded, and will be put somewhere accessible, I believe JNCC YouTube channel, and that will allow others to look at it. And please do share it. We will alert you when it goes onto the channel there. I'd also just like to say, please do feedback to us. Contact us at JNCC. Was this a good event? Did it work for you? We are being genuine when we say we want to be transparent and engage all stakeholders. So help us with that. Tell us if we got it right with this. Tell us what we can do better for the next one. We're really open to that feedback. With that, I'd like to say thank you ever so much to the audience for participating. Thank you ever so much for the panel. And hopefully see you at something similar. And we're looking forward to publishing the UK's NBSAP in the new year, in the spring. All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of your afternoons. Ta-ra.
Thank you very much, everyone. Bye.